I happen to remember when my first encounter with painting. I was 2, and it was finger painting. Had a pile of magenta and a pile of dark green, and I put my fingers in it. And I observed right away that my fingers made worms, 3-dimensional worms, and I thought, well, that would be my foreground image. And then I saw the colors begin to mix, and I thought, well, I need to, if I don't want to lose the identity of the red and the green, then I need to go ahead and get the background on there, and then the worms can be on top. And I just was beginning to hold this in my mind, and they picked me up and started wiping off my hands. And I just started yelling because I wasn't finished. And I thought, if I just had a little longer, I could be really good at this. And I still had the same thought today, with almost every painting. A little more time, I'm going to be really good at this. There were 2 generations of scientists between me and the poet. I did not know it at the time that I was out in the park wandering around looking for painting subjects, but I was attracted to many of the same things as my great-grandfather, and I did feel a certain kinship. There's some correspondences between his work and mine. He died right on the cusp of modernism in 1914. He started to write a poem about skyscrapers and a few other things. He was looking ahead. Well, there's a proverb that I'll quote. If the father cannot, the son may bring it to a conclusion. And so he died relatively young. And so without putting too much emphasis on that as a goal, that's what I'm doing. Photorealism in particular is a movement that's more concerned with the photograph, being in dialogue with the photograph, rendering the photograph and being interested in photographic qualities. For me, photography is a tool. And it is a time saver. Things that are too large to bring in the studio, too ephemeral, too evanescent, too temporary, I capture, if I can, with a photograph. Photograph's information. People will say, oh, your pictures look like a photograph, and they do, but they don't look like the photograph I began with always. I spent 2 years painting 4 seasons of a sycamore tree. The first year to capture the image in all 4 seasons, and the second year finishing the paintings. It took a long time. Each of them was 8 feet tall. So they weren't life-size, but they were bigger than a person. They had to be related to with the body. At the end of that time, I showed up and a man came up to me and we were looking at them side by side and he said, that's a tree, isn't it? I like trees. Well, I'd crawled all over those trees like an ant for a couple of years. I'd seen every square inch of that tree and was intimately familiar with it. I knew a lot about that tree. I knew that the healed broken limb probably came off in 1974 during the tornado in Louisville. There was history in that tree. There was a lot of feeling in it. And so I said, sure, I like trees too. Whatever arises in your heart, whatever image appears in your mind, you can find it within 100 steps of where you are. Whatever it is, somewhere in the reflection of an oil slick on a hubcap or whatever, you can find it if you can see it. And this to me is really fascinating. And sometimes it's not clear what the image in your heart is, but still with alertness and listening, you can see it. I had a teacher for some years, a man from Baghdad, who taught me about teaching as well as about personal cultivation. And there's a story from that tradition of a singer named Dowd. And this speaks directly, to my mind, to where art comes from. If you have no inspiration, this story would give you a clue. And it's the story of Dowd, who was a singer, the voice of the age. And the Sultan wanted to hear him sing, but Dowd would only sing when he was inspired. And the Sultan said, well, that's fine for him, but for my part, I want to hear him while I want to hear him. Well, the Sultan had a Sufi advisor and said, well, let's go to his house and see what may happen. And they knocked on the door. Dowd's servant came to the door and said, my master is seeing no one and he's not singing, and closed the door. So the Sufi and the Sultan went out to the curb and sat down. And the Sultan said, what shall we do? And the Sufi stood up and began to sing. And he had a lovely, cultivated voice, and he sang a song, and the Sultan said, well, that was wonderful. We may not need to hear Dowd now. And the Sufi put his finger to his lips. And at that moment, from the upstairs window, Dowd began to sing. And both the Sufi and the Sultan went into a trance because Dowd was beyond anything. And at the end of the song, they were wiping tears from their eyes, and the Sultan said, how did you know? How did you know? The Sufi said, that was Dowd's favorite song. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist. Oil paint is wonderful. We didn't have oil paint before the Renaissance, and it was really developed to render flesh. For the first time, the paint wasn't dry as soon as it hit the surface, so you could blend it. And in the first generation of oil painters, you get Leonardo da Vinci and his beautiful, lovely transitions from light to shadow that are so soft you can't see them. When he first began, you can see the technique. There's one Leonardo in the United States, Ginevra da Vinci, in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. If you get up close, which is hard to do because there are crowds, you can see his fingerprints in the paint because his best blending tool was his tapping forefinger. Technique is a means to an end, but it takes a long time to learn how to paint with oils. I began when I was about 8 with my grandmother, who was a fine amateur painter and who studied with a European portrait painter in Cincinnati. And her lessons stay with me still. The most important one being that implicitly, painting has a being as well as a doing. I mean, a physical reality as well as whatever image or communication people take from it, whatever effect it will have. That's its doing. But its being is how it's made. I begin with either a fine portrait linen or a surface that I create myself on a panel or sometimes on canvas, very smooth as a rule, because that's what I like. I call it the cult of the immaculate object, and it should be valuable before I begin. I have now probably 150, 170 different pigments, different substances, including lapis lazuli for blue, the gemstone, malachite, a lot of different beautiful, beautiful things. Some things poison, some things exotic, some things quite ordinary. The pigment red oxide is iron, it's rust. But at the center of our blood is the hemoglobin molecule is an iron atom, which is, when oxidized, becomes red. It's the color of blood. So this paint is actually the same physical substance as blood, and in painting a portrait, it's a pigment. It's very useful, but it has a being as well as a doing. It looks a certain way, but it actually is the same substance. I didn't go to graduate school, but I have a graduate diploma, and my graduate diploma is a painting that I made. I made the paper, I made the ink, I made the brush from a squirrel tail, and the writing. My diploma is written in Chinese calligraphy, which is my kind of painter's hobby. And it takes about 10,000 hours to master any skill. And had I known what it took to master Chinese calligraphy, and I won't say I've mastered it, but I've come a long way. I don't know if I would have embarked. My first teacher, for example, said for me to use my right hand. Well, I'm left-handed. And I tried to convince her that I was left-handed, and finally she understood perfectly, although it sounded as if she did not. She said, no left-handed calligraphers use right hand. So I used my right hand, and she said, practice on newspaper. I said, newsprint? She said, no, newspaper. Nothing you do for 2 years will be worth anything. And so I practiced the same character for 2 years. Every day I would, this was when I was in college, I tore up the Boston Globe, and each panel of the paper was a practice sheet for me, and I wrote the same, depending on how big the Boston Globe was, that was my day's practice. It made me understand the connection between discipline and freedom. Freedom is choice. If you have a choice with your skill to do whatever it is that you wish to do, then you are free. And the way you get that is through work and discipline. And that's what the Chinese calligraphy gave me. My teacher said, the way you teach is you set an example. So my painting is my example. Until I hear something else. This is an amazing journey. For me, painting is a mirror that I can look in and see what is important to me and what comes next. But it's also a mirror that you can talk to, in the sense that there's a dialogue. If I want to be a better painter, I need to be a better person. But if I make my painting better, in a way I become a better person. So if I change the painting, I change the person. If I change the person, I change the painting. That's the dialogue with the mirror there. And for me, what happens in that process, always, the most important part is the gift. Because somewhere in the process, a gift will happen. You could call it an accident, you could call it chance, I call it a gift. The painter, Turner, said, "I never waste an accident." And of course I know exactly what he meant. The gift is something that by definition you cannot compel, you can't buy it, you can't control it. In the 20th century, people ran after it in dozens of ways with drugs and strange psychology and automatic writing and flinging paint and chance, anything to get beyond their limit. But that's not the way. You can't make the gift come. The gift will come when you're worthy, when you create a worthy place. And the way you do that is you show up. You show up to work. And eventually this happens. And once it happens, you become convinced that's the reason this is still important to us. We read a lot about how painting is dead, painting is over, painting is obsolete, this business of colored mud on scraps of cloth. Well, we have video, we have all sorts of digital technology. Be part of the present, be part of the future. Let's be modern, let's be postmodern, let's be neo. Well, painting is 30,000 years old. It's maybe over 30,000 years old. This is an activity we've been doing as a species, we've been participating in for a very long time. It is not likely that in our generation it will suddenly be over. It's important to me to this extent. A painting may last 500 years. There is in the Frick Museum in New York a portrait of Sir Thomas More by Hans Holbein. And it's been fairly recently cleaned, where you just take the varnish off and replace it. There are no cracks in it, and the colors are fresh as they were when he put them down. I try to think that the painting may last for 500 years, but the permanence is part of my responsibility towards the being of the painting. It is not that I feel a need to be permanent, to leave my mark on the world, or to have something that remains after me as a record. It's simply to be true to the craft that I do that. I feel this, that the images already exist in the invisible world. The invisible world used to be much more real to people than it is now. It is still real. We go there every night in our dreams. We have a connection. This business of survival, of life after death, or any of this sort of thing. The invisible world is very real. That's where paintings come from. So in a sense, I just am a facilitator, moving them from one world into this one. For a while they exist, but in a way they will always exist. I believe that whatever has existed does exist. Painting is an infinite journey. It's a road that never ends. No one has ever got to the end of it. Not Velázquez, not Rembrandt, not Leonardo. No one has ever got to the end of it. When I would tell my students, they'd be discouraged. You mean we can't ever win, we can't ever get to the end? I said, what this means is that there's still fresh territory for you to discover. This may be an old art, a traditional art, but it will always be fresh. There will always be room for something new, because it goes as deep as you go.